I'ma end all that. It's gonna be Marty world. It's gonna be my time, and y'all gonna move when I say move.
And began to turn its efforts toward the war's Pacific theater. At the February 1945 Yalta Conference, the Soviet Union agreed to join the fight against Japan soon after Germany's surrender. American General Douglas MacArthur expected the Soviets to engage with Japanese forces in the occupied Chinese territory of Manchuria. Soon afterwards, the Americans would commence an invasion of the Japanese home islands. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union did just that by declaring war on Japan and almost simultaneously beginning their attack on Manchuria. By this point, FDR had died and Harry Truman had taken his place. Truman met with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in July and August at the Potsdam Conference. Stalin learned that the US had a new and powerful weapon on its hands, though Truman didn't necessarily specify that the US had nuclear capabilities. It did surely make Truman's Potsdam threat of prompt and utter destruction against Japan sound far more serious than just some performative chest thumping, though. To many Allied strategists, a land invasion of Japan was practically inevitable, but the prospect of sending thousands of troops into the country wasn't exactly a pleasant idea. The US had overtaken smaller territories, but with great effort and many casualties. An estimated 13,000 American service members were killed in the struggle for Okinawa, about 35% of the forces sent to that small outlying island.
We had crossed the island, and that was when our trouble began.
That bloody toll was certainly on the minds of Truman and others. They believed that a land invasion of Japan's home islands would produce at least as many casualties at Okinawa, if not more. Those projections didn't include Japanese deaths, although the assumption was that those numbers would be staggering as well. At one point, Truman wrote, "My object is to save as many American lives as possible, but I also have a human feeling for the women and children of Japan." Despite these concerns, plans for a ground invasion known as Operation Downfall were put into motion. Conceived in early 1945, the operation was intended to target the islands of Kyushu and Honshu and slated to begin in December that year. The use of poison in various forms was also considered during the plans to invade Japan. One possibility was an herbicide applied to rice crops, although this wouldn't have been feasible until after the start of the land invasion. Plus, the rice may have been needed to feed Allied troops. Moreover, millions of Japanese civilians could have died, especially considering that the country was deeply food insecure by 1945. But this strategy could have been reconsidered if the invasion went on for an extended period. General George C. Marshall also pushed for the use of poison gas, though he told President Truman that it would be only used against combatants who wouldn't surrender. Marshall argued that gassing soldiers would spare the lives of American personnel, as opposed to having them confront Japanese forces face to face, which happened at Iwo Jima. But Truman refused to give the go-ahead. His argument was based on a precedent established by his predecessor. FDR had said that he would only allow it if the enemy deployed its own poison gas attacks first. Now, there's no indication that this option was ever completely off the table, though. If a land invasion proved difficult or the mounting number of casualties began to weigh heavily on commanders, then Truman could very well have been persuaded that gas attacks were a necessary evil.
The gas burnt my throat, caused pains in my chest, and made breathing all but impossible.
The United States hardly planned to conduct a land
Man, nigga, not worry about all that. Your pain in your chest and whoop to wop and all that. And I'ma keep it real, y'all. My mind, when he said that, like the last 10 seconds of his sentence, my mind was in a whole nother planet. But from my circumstances of this video, y'all talking about war, and you talking about your chest, your back, your head, your whoop to wop. Man, they not trying to hear that. This war, anybody could get it.
Invasion alone. By July 1945, the British Chiefs of Staff outlined campaigns of their own that were meant to retake parts of Southeast Asia and Singapore. But some officials worried that these plans weren't enough. If there wasn't a significant British presence in Operation Downfall, would the American attitude toward one of its allies sour? And how would Asian nations feel about Britain returning after the war and attempting to manage territories after having done so little to repel the invading Japanese forces? So even though Douglas MacArthur was set to oversee Operation Downfall and the whole operation was to be completed with American oversight, it was also agreed that Great Britain would contribute. And so British troops were set to take over for some of the American divisions that were supposed to invade Honshu. There were also plans for other soldiers from parts of the Commonwealth to join in the land invasion, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. British divisions would have been able to keep their own uniforms, but for simplicity's sake, they would have all been given American weapons and other supplies before the invasion began. Now, by the summer of 1945, the American Navy had already established a blockade of Japan. If Japan refused to surrender, then this strategy would have intensified. Alas, this could have led to the deaths of millions of people by cutting off supplies to a nation that had long depended on imports. Japan had already been experiencing these difficulties for years, as President Roosevelt had shut down exports of steel and oil after the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. Goods from Japanese territories in the Pacific were similarly cut off, largely by mines and submarines patrolling nearby waters. As the war went on, this blockade became more aggressive. The American military produced more weapons, crafts, and soldiers. By 1945, Japan's imports had slowed to a mere trickle. American strategists didn't necessarily know that Japan's agricultural sector was already in dire straits. Rice crops performed poorly in 1945, so a blockade that halted food imports could have been profoundly deadly. Plans to attack the country's rail system would have exacerbated this problem. Strikes on the rail infrastructure, which was already limited, would have made it even more difficult to move rice around the country to hungry citizens. Furthermore, shipping goods during the war from one region of Japan to another along the coast was also all but impossible due to the blockade.
Japan was basically in ruins at this point.
Considering the resistance that Allied forces encountered in Japanese-held territories like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, commanders expected opposition on the main islands of Japan to be at least as fierce, if not more so. They got ready for the seemingly very real possibility of a long and arduous occupation. General MacArthur, who was the Allied commander of Japan from 1945 to 1951, was among those who predicted that an occupation after a land invasion would be a grinding slog. Specifically, he expected a decade or more of attempting to control Japan, which would be all the more difficult by the possible presence of guerrilla fighters. It was widely assumed at the time that the Japanese people thought they were winning, or at least believed that they could still prevail in the face of Allied encroachment. But there's evidence that higher-ups in the Japanese military were less optimistic. While the Allies were planning Operation Downfall, Japanese officials made the reasonable assumption that an invasion was in the works and that it would eventually make its way to Tokyo. In response, some of them planned suicide attacks or similar initiatives. There were others, though, including Emperor Hirohito and his advisors, who pushed for a much less bloody diplomatic solution, even if it meant finally admitting defeat.
Man, you cannot be complaining when it's war. You cannot be talking about your back hurt, your neck hurt. You gotta go to the gym. You gotta do this. You gotta do that. Man, only thing you got time for in war is making bombs and go to war. It's Marty 2 Major, and I'm checking out. Peace.